Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to the worst 10 American presidents in history. Now, this should be quite an interesting topic because, I imagine that even if there's certain, key performance indicators that you can use to assess this, a lot of this is going to be quite subjective. It's going to be, there's going to be a lot of personal opinion that comes into it. Mr. Beat does a great job of tackling these types of topics from as an unbiased perspective as possible. So it's going to be interesting to see how he decides to rank the presidents. So yeah, this should be quite interesting. So let's do it.
What is up? I am Mr. Beat, and President's Day is over, so no longer are we going to be praising past presidents, but we are going to be talking trash about past presidents.
Somebody send Obama some life hacks on how to be a good president. Haha. Like I bet that would help. LOL.
Here is my video counting down the
10 worst presidents in American history.
According to my opinion, this is just my opinion, I'm a little biased, we all are, so keep that in mind. I'm also aware that this may reveal some of my political beliefs, and that's fine. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it, as Philip DeFranco says. Number 10, Benjamin Harrison. Okay, he was all about really high tariffs, and you all know how I feel about tariffs, right? Right, I'm not a very big fan of tariffs. Bad job, Benjamin.
So by tariffs, those are, essentially taxes that you have to, or a corporation would pay in order to trade, So for example, if you wanted to sell X amount of gas, you had to pay a certain percentage of that towards the government.
Harrison was supportive of the overthrow of Queen Leokwilani and the taking of Hawaii, which is one of the shadiest parts of American history. Also, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred under his watch. Okay, not only did Harrison approve, but the Army gave out medals of honor like they were candy afterward for a massacre. Number 9. Andrew Johnson. Now, I wasn't going to put him on this list. I feel like a lot of historians talk a lot of trash about him unfairly, but, I'm all about character, right? And this guy was driven by his ego. This guy cared first and foremost only about his own legacy and his own desires. He refused to compromise, and he seemed to dig in his heels when he faced opposition. Speaking of opposition, just as blatant opposition to civil rights for African Americans, as seen with his fighting the 14th and 15th Amendments and Civil Rights Act, that ended up holding back African Americans for generations. This makes him look exceptionally bad, and he was a white supremacist. But mostly, though, his stubbornness in politics. I know the radical Republicans.
It's actually crazy because, obviously I'm not American, but I've not even heard of Andrew Johnson. Because it's interesting, there's only been, I think, 46 US presidents now. And to be honest, now that I think about it, I could probably only name maybe 15 to 20 of them, which I still think is pretty good for someone who's not from America.
That he opposed were also stubborn, but his refusal to compromise with them just made it look like he only cared about his own selfish desires and didn't care about the greater good of the country. Number 8, George W. Bush.
Wow.
Okay,
interesting.
Obviously I'm even more biased living through the presidency of George W. Bush, but I disagreed with his response to the 9/11 attacks in several ways. The AUMF, or the Authorization to Use Military Force Against Terrorists, basically give a blank check for the president to fight terrorism around the world. It's still in effect. The Patriot Act, which really was one of the worst laws ever passed in American history, really just stripped many civil liberties that Americans used to take for granted. The Iraq War, dragging out the Afghanistan War with no end in sight. Not a fan of all these things. His response to Hurricane Katrina. The Great Recession happened under his watch, and he responded to it with crony capitalism, which I'm not a big fan of. Bailing out banks and corporations, etc. No Child Left Behind. No teacher I know actually is a fan of No Child Left Behind. Not a good law.
What's No Child Left Behind? Someone give me a brief rundown of it, please.
He expanded the surveillance state. The Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, all that. Detaining suspects without warrants who were never charged with any crime, never given any due process, just showed that he often made decisions out of fear, not out of reason. But such a nice guy, though. I love you, W. Sorry about this, if you're watching. Number 7, Woodrow Wilson. First of all, Cypher from The Cynical Historian has definitely influenced my perception of Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson!
So a shout out to him. Go watch his 2 videos where he just completely bashes him. Wilson was all about spreading democracy around the world, a very egocentric foreign policy. Sure, it said, hey, self-determination, right? But it assumed that Americans knew what was best for the entire world, and thus Wilson paved the way for future American interventionism. One big reason why he got elected in 1916 was because he said he kept the country out of World War I. What happens after he gets reelected? He gets the country involved in World War I, asking Congress to declare war, and they do. And during the war, the Espionage Act, the Sedition.
But, you know, I'm not an expert in world history, but the world kind of needed America's intervention in World War I mean, based on what I've heard was happening in the Soviet Union, like, America's intervention was desperately needed.
Act, 2 of the worst laws in American history, urinating on the First Amendment. And Cypher pointed this out in one of his videos. I never knew this, but apparently he wanted the Sedition Act before the United States even entered World War I. And most of our presidents were racist, okay? We've got to consider historical relativism, but Wilson was exceptionally racist even for his time. The screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House and then calling it historically accurate, not a very smart move by Wilson. Ignoring all the lynchings that were going on across the country when he was president. He ignored a lot of things, apparently, ignoring women's rights. You know, they were marching across the country for the right to vote. He ignored them. He ignored the first Red Scare going on, a lot of chaos around the country, didn't do anything about it. Number 6, William McKinley. This one may surprise many of you because McKinley is consistently ranked in the top half of presidents, usually because the economy was good when he was president, and the US was becoming a world superpower due to a more aggressive foreign policy. Well, guess what? This foreign policy sucked. McKinley's foreign policy was based on a Christian/American exceptionalism mentality that meant the U.S. was going to be spreading its influence around the world in places it shouldn't be. The Spanish-American War, a war built on lies. McKinley, you know, he struggled with the decision at first, but after talking to God, God said, yes, you should go to war with Spain, and so he went to Congress after that.
But I would imagine that at this time, you know, it looks to me that he was president somewhere in the late 1800s. I imagine religion was a huge pillar of support for a lot of people and politicians alike at that time. It's kind of me just playing devil's advocate a little bit, but yeah, I would think to say that because he used religion as his kind of moral framework kind of isn't fair considering the time in which he was president.
And they declared war on Spain. The Philippine-American War that happened as a continuation of the Spanish-American War, that doesn't get much attention because it makes the United States look pretty bad. But McKinley justified that war, a war in which Americans killed civilians and rounded them up and put them into concentration camps. McKinley justified this because he thought the Filipinos were incapable of self-governing. He was the first to bypass Congress to send troops to fight in China during the Boxer Rebellion. As I said earlier, yes, the economy was doing well under McKinley's watch, but he had high tariffs. And again, I am not a fan of high tariffs. But mostly I'm a critic of McKinley due to his brash imperialism and his general disregard for the sovereignty of nations that just wanted to be left alone. Number 5, Richard Nixon.
Interesting. Now this is someone that I recognize.
He was a pathological liar who mostly just cared about himself and his own legacy, not the general welfare of the country. Boy, did that backfire. I know there are a lot of obvious reasons to hate on Nixon. He was a crook. I mean, Watergate. His paranoia and backstabbing make it seem obvious why he's on this list and most people's lists. However, the war on drugs is probably the biggest mistake of Nixon. Nixon started the war on drugs, and we are still seeing the horrible effects of it, so that's why that tops my list of problems with Nixon. Nixon got elected promising to end the Vietnam War. but the war just dragged on during.
I wonder how much, if you had to attach a dollar amount in terms of the cost of the war on drugs, it's got to be in the at least tens of billions of dollars, right? It just, and all it did essentially was create a huge black market. You know, I think that now that we're heading into 2022, considering the war on drugs, I think, has been around since the 80s or something, maybe it's time for us to rethink and just tackle it in a different way.
During his presidency. Meanwhile, while secretly dropping bombs and cancer-causing chemicals on civilians in both Vietnam and Cambodia, he implemented wage and price controls, and this was horrible for the economy. A big reason why the horrible stagflation of the 70s occurred was because of his administration. Now, don't get me wrong, Nixon did a lot of good and was highly intelligent. Opening up relations with China, his policy of détente with the Soviet Union, and the creation of the EPA are probably my favorite 3 accomplishments of Nixon, but he had such poor character. And a booger sticking out. Number 4, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, of course, makes many lists because of the Great Depression. It's actually a myth that Herbert Hoover did nothing in response to the early stages in what would become known as the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, for example, in 1929.
I'm guessing that the Hoover Dam was named after Herbert Hoover. That thing is super impressive, by the way. I need to see a reactive video about it.
Raising import taxes, increasing income taxes to balance the budget, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to bail out businesses, and increased crony capitalism likely just made things worse. Under his watch, a recession became the Great Depression. His treatment of the World War I bonus army veterans in DC was disgraceful. Simply put, Hoover did try to end the Great Depression, but simply made it worse. FDR didn't have much success either after that, but at least FDR seemed to be more in touch with ordinary people. Hoover seemed very out of touch with most Americans. Number 3, Franklin Pierce. Oh, Pierce, where do I begin? I know, how about with the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Again, a law that was one of the worst laws passed in American history, and he signed it into law. A doughface. Sorry, that was a little harsh there, but, you know, a northerner who was perfectly fine.
What does that mean, a doughface?
Fine with slavery. The Ostend Manifesto. Pierce seemed to be okay with declaring war on Spain if it refused to sell Cuba to the United States. Pierce wanted Cuba annexed as a slave state. Boy, did that make northerners happy. At a rocky time when the country needed unity, Pierce arguably helped further divide the country. Also, at a time when the country needed a more hands-on and active president, he was not. But you know who was worse? Number 2, James Buchanan. That's right, Buchanan was worse. He took over as president after Pierce, and instead of learning from Pierce's mistakes, he just let the country become even more divided. Another case. You didn't have to bleep that out. I said Okay, doughface. He was a president who did nothing. He didn't want to make anyone mad, but he also didn't want to
Too passive. I see.
Make anyone happy. He was personally against slavery. He said it was morally wrong, and yet proceeded to speak out in favor for the Dred Scott decision, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. In fact, he was so pro-South that he basically just let the South do whatever they wanted. When the states seceded after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, he blamed the Northerners and the abolitionists. By the time he was out of office, the United States was on the brink of civil war, and the Union had fallen apart, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. And the worst president in American history, in my opinion, is Warren Harding. He once said, quote, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here."
As soon as he said that, I mean, he should have been removed from office, surely. It's just a complete lack of, self-belief.
I agree. He appointed many of his corrupt buddies to be in his cabinet. Some of them famously got in trouble for bribery in what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal. I know this sounds bad, but he was probably our dumbest president. He was not a deep thinker at all. He seemed to just let all of his corrupt buddies make all the decisions. He didn't stand for anything. You didn't know where he stood because he rarely stated where he stood on issues.
If he was so bad, how did he win? Like, how did he get past through all of the stages it takes to reach the presidency?
He seemed to have no moral compass. While president, he would often cheat on his wife, and he had parties in the White House where they would illegally gamble and smuggle in alcohol at the height of Prohibition. He didn't ever get much work done. He preferred socializing and partying to working. When he actually did work, he signed crappy laws. One law he actually did sign was the Emergency Quota Act, which was really a law designed to favor Western and Northern European immigrants and limit immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as most of the rest of the world. To sum it up, while Harding was a nice guy who was easy to get along with, he surrounded himself with shady characters and avoided any action whatsoever while in office. He was just a horrible president. And if you haven't noticed by this point, character means a lot to me in terms of how I view a president. Though there are, of course, exceptions like Harding, who I just mentioned, and George W. Bush. I love you, man.
Hold on. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get... Was he trying to say the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me?
But you just made some really bad decisions while in office. Well, that will do it. Those are my 10 least favorite presidents.
Very interesting list. I have to say, I don't recognize, or I didn't recognize about 70%, so 7 out of 10 of the entries. The only ones that I recognized were Nixon, George W. Bush, and oh god, to be honest, yeah, those were the only two. Really interesting list. I would love to know what you guys think. Do you guys have similar viewpoints to Mr. Beat here? You know, do you think he was just wildly biased? Just let me know. I'd love to know. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.